October yet again! And you know what that means. Time to put aside all of our fancy literary fiction in favor of some spooky, scary crap that we can read for Halloween. I did that yet again this year, and now I'm going to tell you about the book I read. I chose an Argentinian novel by an author whose book shot her to international acclaim, and that book is called Tender as the Flesh by Agustina Bazterrica. I've been hearing a lot of great things about this novel ever since it came out, and I was excited to finally get into it. It's set in a dystopian future where an animal-born virus leads humanity to saying, fuck it, let's just kill all the animals except for ourselves, and while that would obviously have some massive ramifications for humans, they have bigger problems. Namely, where are we gonna get all our burgers? So they band together and use humanity's abilities to problem solve, and with a little help from corporate lobbying, they decide to just mass murder each other by factory farming each other for human meat on an industrial scale. This turned out to be a pretty spooky read for Halloween. The story centers around a guy named Marcus. He's been working in the meat industry ever since it consisted of cows and chickens, but now that it consists of humans, he tries not to think too hard about it. After all, he's got to make a living, and he's got to provide for his elderly father, so then might as well do what everyone else is doing. And the other thing is that he's lost his family recently. He's still processing that. His ex-wife is estranged from him. He's checked out from life. He's kind of going through everything on autopilot, and the prose reflects that. As the world is cannibalizing itself, the prose is very dry and detached, and even when you're given this very horrific description of the process of turning humans into food, it's done in this very clinical, itemized sort of way. The people that are being farmed for meat cannot be referred to as people. You're taking a very big risk if you humanize them in any way. So instead, they're referred to simply as meat or head. And even if one of them happens to escape, they've been isolated their whole lives, they can't talk or communicate, so they're going to be behaving a lot more animalistically than society people. So all of this makes it way easier to dehumanize and separate yourself from the poor people that are destined for the slaughterhouse. But sometimes society people are put into the meat grinder as punishment. Marco is quite complacent about all of this until something falls into his lap that shakes that complacency to its core and leaves him to reckon with the new reality he's in. And it might also provide him an opportunity to regain what he's lost after his family estranged him. It goes without saying that Tender as the Flesh is absolutely not for the faint of heart. It's unflinchingly brutal and nihilistic just from the premise alone, and that's before you even get into the horrific gore that gets described throughout the book. But despite that, I wouldn't quite consider it a horror novel per se. It's more of a dystopian future novel in the mold of Brave New World or 1984. It's slow-paced, it's a razor-sharp critique of our society that uses its dystopian future as a means of conveying its message. Rather than being very story-driven, it's more focused on its themes, and it uses motifs such as language to discuss how our society permits a lot of atrocities to happen just because manipulative language is coded over it. This idea of language informing our reality is repeated over and over again. The characters are described by how they talk or the words they use, and of course, the main victims of this story are unable to speak at all. Like a lot of other dystopian future novels, this book is very focused on conveying an issue, confronting you with it, and forcing you to sort of grapple with it and provoke discussion about it. And of course, the issue here is the meat industry. The book's perspective on it is very similar to a quote by Paul McCartney, where he says that if all slaughterhouses had glass windows, everyone would be a vegetarian, because they would see the suffering, there'd be no avoiding it, no euphemism could cover up for it, right? But unfortunately, Despite my own feelings for the meat industry, I think this argument is one of the weaker ones against meat, because there are plenty of cultures out there throughout history who are very involved with meat as a process. But we live in a post-scarcity society, so-called, because we can select where we get our protein from at the superstore, and we have alienation between us and the process of getting meat. So when we finally see that process, it's shocking. But of course, that doesn't apply to all cultures or all places in the world. So it's kind of a little bit of a shaky argument to make. Now, of course, there are tons of reasons why people would want to distance themselves from eating meat and the meat industry. So my minor qualms with how it presents the issue are not that big a deal. Plus, I enjoy a lot of other horror content that criticizes the meat industry. For example, Cows by Matthew Stokoe, or the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So yeah, I might have a few quibbles with how it presents itself, but at the end of the day, I think this book is still fairly effective in getting you to think about eating meat. But even if the meat industry criticisms in this book don't really hit with you, there's plenty of other indictments of society that Bazterrica slips into the story. The meat industry in this book could be a metaphor for things like slavery, colonialism, and human trafficking. There's also this idea that we are alienated from all of these issues in our own society, that we'd rather not think about it, that we can only really go about with a smile on our face if we have our head in the sand about the horrible things that we continuously benefit from. Think of all the cheap products we buy and how so many of them were made by people working at slave wages or children in other countries. There's also this reminder again and again that there's these historical events that are similar to what is happening in this book. There's a lot of references to the Nazis and other genocidal governments like that. And of course, we're reminded that a lot of these issues are still going on and we continue to benefit from them, but would rather not talk about it. So the book is trying to tell us that yes, we really do cannibalize our own. Although the themes in this book are definitely interesting, it also suffers from the issues that I tend to have with a lot of dystopian fiction. Namely, it's very heavy-handed in a lot of places. The characters seem like very transparent mouthpieces for conveying the author's message, as opposed to immersing you in the world organically. And the book is also very focused on its premise alone, and it's very front-loaded as a result. Like, right at the start, you get a big torrent of exposition about, like, this is how the world works, isn't it terrifying? But at about a third of the way in, that stops, and you end up with a very dull middle section, even though this is the point where Marcos is making big decisions that could cost him everything. So you should feel all this suspense and stuff, but because of the very clinical, detached prose I mentioned earlier, it starts to work against the story, and he ends up just kind of milling around in these barren locations and thinking about everything, I guess. So I don't think the book makes the best use of its time. This was especially true when it comes to Marco's character. Although we spend a lot of time with him and in his thoughts, he seems ill-defined for a lot of the book, and I think the ending really threw away some of what was being established about him. Like, yes, I get it, Marco is a scumbag in a lot of ways, obviously, but the book seemed to be alluding to something going on with him, and it seemed to completely dispense with that. I feel like the end of the book could have been a lot better if it had been set up properly. Although Tender is the Flesh is definitely a decent book, I was still a little bit disappointed that it didn't live up to the full potential of its premise. But that said, it's still an interesting, thought-provoking little book. It's a great, short, creepy read for Halloween. I give it a 6 out of 10, and I would recommend it to anyone who's interested in extremely gory, twisted books with a little bit of food for thought to chew on. You see what I did there? That's a pun. Puns are the real terror. But anyway, that's it for my review. Happy Halloween! What did you think of the book? What did you think of that ending? I am keen to discuss it because I'm pretty torn on it myself. And Do you eat meat? Why or why not? If you eat meat, how do you sleep at night? I use melatonin, but I'd be curious to hear your recommendations as well. That's me. I've been deep in the reads. Happy Halloween, good night, and good luck.